I just want to say first, it's such an honor to have Anne with us.
It's an honor. It's so nice to see you.
Yeah, we worked together for a long time. In fact, she probably doesn't remember this. The work I'm doing here at Hopkins on protection of healthcare and conflict, Anne was there at the beginning when she was at IRC and helped us get going. So I really thank you for being here.
That's why when I said that they targeted hospitals, I kind of paused there, because I knew you folks would say, ooh, that's really bad. It's the schools and the workplaces are okay, but the hospital is very bad.
So I noticed a coincidence in your talk that yesterday you flew from Berlin, and yesterday Secretary Kerry made his announcement in Berlin.
How about that?
And my guess is, and you don't have to comment on this, that you might have some smidgen to do with that decision. But
Although I must say that I'm surrounded by people in the Obama administration who want to bring more refugees to the United States. So there is a lot of support for the things that we are suggesting. And the tricky part for me is I'm also supposed to be the manager of the people to make it happen. And making it happen is the tough part.
Well, so that was a softball. You're certainly aware that about 20 former high-level leaders at the State Department and the Department of Defense wrote a letter last week saying we need to do 100,000, and they didn't really say it, but Germany has a terrorism problem as well, and we have a much bigger population. Do you see prospects of getting to 100,000 a year?
Well, you heard me say in my remarks, we can't just go pick up plane loads of people and fly them over here. It won't be tolerated by, I think, the American people. The certain communities certainly don't want that. They're registering that with me and members of Congress. When we went up and consulted with the leaders of the judiciary committees in the Senate and the House, they were really, you heard two things. One group said, bring more, and the other said, be careful with those Syrians. How are you going to keep out jihadis? And we have to be able to design a program that can satisfy both voices, I think. And I do think security is important. What I am trying to get across to people is that the risks are very small because we have such a tight screening process. Most refugees are the victims of terrorists. They are not terrorists. And yet, I think in the minds of some people, perhaps because they've been reading the newspaper, all these terrible things that happen overseas, day in and day out, they think that if you're a Syrian or an Iraqi or an Afghan, you must be someone who is prone to violence. And so that's that. But by talking about families, and I encourage the press to get out, profiles of families. I was really pleased this morning. NPR had a story about a Syrian man who had fled Syria and gone to Texas, and the terrible things that happened to him and his family. Anybody with a heart listening would want to help this guy. He clearly is the victim of atrocities and not likely to perpetuate them at all. I did get the letter from former administration officials, many Republicans and Democrats, many personal friends of mine, telling me to do something that I think is impossible to do in the short term using our current structure, our current process for bringing folks in. So my bosses are really pressuring us to take a tough, hard-headed look at the process and see if there are ways to streamline it, speed it up without cutting corners on security.
Turning to aid, as you mentioned correctly, the U.S. is by far the leader in humanitarian aid. But for Syrians in the region, the world is only contributing, we talked about 37% of what's needed, and the World Food Program has just cut rations. Is there anything the U.S. can do to put pressure on other governments to do more?
Yes, and we do that. We do it a lot, actually. And I think we're making some progress. Like I say in my talk, we see Gulf states writing bigger checks now, but they don't participate in a regular basis so that the UN can plan. And there's also a sense among them sometimes that maybe the UN is charging too much for overhead. So we're trying to make sure that there's a good conversation going on between some of the Gulf states that are choosing to write big checks and the UN, which is the system I'd like to see them invest in. You know, we invest, like I said, in the UN and also the best non-governmental organizations. And by investing through the UN, we can bring some of these countries to sort of have a seat at the table to discuss these humanitarian problems, discuss solutions, improve the way the whole international community, as we call it, responds to crises. So one of the people that's influenced me a lot on this is High Commissioner Antonio Guterres, because he thinks that a lot of the humanitarian approaches have been sort of developed and pursued by Western countries, and that we have to somehow bridge to the East, to Muslim-majority countries especially, and have to get sort of universal buy-in to our principles or to something like them, so that this is no longer just sort of a Western government, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, exercise.
What would you have everybody here do? What could the students do?
Yeah, I think it'd be really great if you could do a couple things. I can't tell you to lobby Congress, but and I think that Congress is doing a good job. So I guess it would be great if Congress were to hear that there is support for what they've been doing in terms of this bipartisan support. Because I'm afraid that the security, bring more people divide will sort of erupt along partisan lines, and that my bureau and our program will suddenly be controversial instead of something that's like a proud American tradition. So usually we try to hint that you should go out and assault Congress. In this case, go out and say, yeah, keep funding that humanitarian aid, keep voting for it, keep approaching it by working across the aisle on this. And I worry a little bit about the presidential candidates are all over the map on this, I think, So follow that. And then I'm really interested in raising more private giving. And so that's something that you all can do, on a small level out of your wallets, or you can, do all sorts of Kickstarter campaigns and social media and all these things that didn't used to exist. So I was pleased to see this hashtag up there on the refugee crisis. And I think there's a lot of really good organizations out there working on different aspects of this. And so you sort of have to decide what appeals to you. Is it that there's some cultural connection you have because of your family that you want to give to SAMS, the Syrian American Medical Society? Or is it something that you really always like, Save the Children and the work they do elsewhere, the International Rescue Committee, Mercy Corps, International Medical Corps? There's just a lot of really good groups. And a lot of them are listed. If you go to USAID, they put up a Syria website, and they've sort of freshened it up. And you can find whole lists of different organizations and choose what path and try to get your friends mobilized. And, or dream big and get the whole community here mobilized. But I think since we don't have enough money to do what we need to do, getting more private giving going would be great.
I'm going to ask one more question, but those of you who want to ask questions, why don't you go to the microphone and we'll take your questions too. The crisis of the refugees going to Europe has raised the visibility of the vulnerability of the people in Syria to barrel bombs and all kinds of other assaults. Is there some kind of review of what U.S. policy is going to be to increase protection in Syria?
I'm working for someone, Secretary of State, who is very interested in what's going on in the Middle East and has spent a lot of time trying to find pathways to peace in the Middle East. So I know this is in the forefront of his mind. He is very interested in using the upcoming UN General Assembly meetings to discuss ways forward with lots of different other countries who will be coming to New York. So yeah, it would not surprise me if he puts the same kind of energy behind this that he's done on the Iran agreement and that he's tried in the past on Middle East peace. And it's very embarrassing working for Secretary Kerry because he is, I don't know, 15, 20 years older than me, and he is in much better shape. And he runs really fast. He's got super long legs. And even hobbled as he was recently, he's still so much healthier than I am, you know. So he's an inspiration in a lot of different ways. But one of the ways is he doesn't give up on trying again to pursue peace.
Okay, so why don't we have some questions?
So I have two questions, actually. One of them is regarding the Gulf states. I've lived in the Gulf region for 3 years, and one of the major issues is that they have weak public health systems, and particularly Saudi and UAE. They don't report and keep good surveillance for infectious diseases. So is that something that you would obviously be worried about with a refugee population? And do you think that it would maybe be smart to send people there? And the second is the comment on post 9/11 America being different and I guess less hospitable to refugees. I'm aware of some research that's gone on where it's been proven that police harassment and sort of othering is highly associated with radicalization, especially in Montreal and Boston with Somali refugees. So as public health practitioners, we're forced to look at the evidence, and we're seeing that this othering and stigmatization and xenophobia is leading to radicalization. So we know the treatment is to be more hospitable and integrate people into our society and make them feel welcome and worthy and that they have dignity. So I guess for us, we know where the evidence is and where to go with it and how to increase mental health services and psychosocial support. So why do the politicians not have that same responsibility to look at the evidence and use evidence to correctly and responsibly integrate people to our society?
Why do politicians not look at evidence? My job would be so different if that were the case, if they did. Okay, starting with the Gulf states, I'd be interested to hear what you think. Because, you know, having worked on refugees for a while now, I was really focused on Southeast Asia, Africa, to a much lesser extent Latin America, but there's a big IDP population, Colombians. So that was kind of my travel pathway. And of course, Palestinians have been displaced in the Middle East for a long time, but I hadn't worked on that. And so having the Middle East just in such unrest, and then have to go to Gulf states after being used to going to places like Juba is a real culture clash for me. Because unlike you, I've never lived in the Gulf states. So to go places where there's so much wealth available, where reception rooms, and we've had 3 conferences in Kuwait, just incredible banquets and food everywhere, and it's part of their welcoming and being generous hosts. So the contrast for me has been quite shocking, you know, and taking some getting to used to, as is the way that women can really be sidelined, or at least in the public arena in some of these countries, which of course I'm very uncomfortable with. And then there's these positive aspects like Muslim tradition of charitable giving, especially around Ramadan. It's sort of all a mix in this. I went to the UAE to talk to them about their refugee policies, in part because Senators Kennedy and Alan Simpson had years ago written something into law that if you wanted to fly directly to our direct flights to our airports and pre-clear Americans coming back home overseas first, which happens in a few select airports, you had to have a good refugee policy. So they weren't signed up to they weren't signatories to the 1951 convention. So I said, well, what is your refugee policy? And they said, well, when refugees come here, if they need help, they go to the Crown Prince, and he helps them. And I thought, this is very different than what we do in the United States. This is not really the counterpart to my office that I was looking for. So working with the Gulf states has been really different. I mean, it makes the job interesting, right? And of course, as you go anywhere, you meet people who are really wonderful and helpful, and others who you're not connecting with at all. So this is something that will be a continuing project, I think. And people like yourself who've lived there. You were asking about having weak public health systems and the potential for the spread of disease, which is incredibly important if you're talking about refugees. Because some have criticized that the Gulf states not only are not giving enough, but they haven't taken enough refugees. They are reliant, many of them, on guest workers or foreign laborers. And so refugees could be filling those slots. But again, if you have a weak public health system, if you've got people who are missing out on normal, regular health care, it does, to me, as a non-expert in the room, present a particular dangers. And on your second point on using evidence, I'm totally with you. And maybe that's an answer to the earlier question about what can you do. You can convince people in positions of authority to look at risks in terms of, manage risks based on smart data and experience rather than sort of the worst case scenarios based on our wildest nightmares.
Thank you.
Next.
So you mentioned security concerns over increasing the number of refugees over 10,000 in the U.S. And so I'm kind of wondering how in Europe, right, where the number of refugees is much higher, how do you convince them that, accepting all these refugees is actually okay, and that, one shouldn't build fences and close borders when, population-wise, they're dealing with a much bigger issue, and the U.S. is having, a conversation about increasing just over 10,000. Especially also then, Russia was mentioned as a country that's potentially contributing to prolonging of the conflict. I would say one could argue that the U.S., by supporting the opposition, also prolongs the conflict. So with this, is there like a need for the U.S. or I guess a justification for the U.S. to have more refugees because of that, because it is involved in the conflict by providing aid?
You have to go to 4:30, right?
Whatever Brian says.
4:30? Why don't we take the other questions and then let's take the other questions, but let's try to make them brief, and then we can get answers before Anne has to leave.
Thank you. Well, here's someone from the Gulf country. My question, I guess, is regarding the Gulf countries as well. So I heard some of our esteemed speakers here saying that the Gulf countries are pouring hundreds of millions of money, but through different channels or in irregular basis. And then other speakers brought the number of Syrian refugee settlement in the Gulf countries to 0. On the other hand, what we hear in our newspapers is, for example, I'm from Saudi Arabia, and the number of Syrian before the war was 1 million. And it's been said that the number is now 1.5 million. But through visa visitor and they have some privileges, actually. They were granted the right to go, the right for healthcare and education. So all Syrian are granted that right. I don't know if that's, I don't want to defend. I think I need to understand. And my question is, would you please elaborate on that, and what message would you like to person from the Gulf to hear?
Why don't we take one more, and then if we have time, we'll take the next two.
Okay. So thanks for briefly going over the legal channels. So as you may know, that the drone child, his aunt actually applied to sponsor him legally in Canada, and ended up dying. So as a preventive measure, maybe the legal channels would prevent more people drowning on shores, although I don't see how to really build an effective and potentially rapid program, rapid legal channels. So is there a plan that I'm not aware of, a strategic time frame that really allow people to come through legal channels, or it is just the very first step?
Let me very quickly take these three questions in reverse order. Canada has two ways in. One is the resettlement through the UNHCR referral system, the way we do. And then in addition to that, they had some kind of a sponsorship program. And in this case, it was a family trying to sponsor family. And we don't have that for refugees. And it would be interesting to see, maybe we could, although it doesn't necessarily mean that it would work faster, because you still need to do the background checks and whatnot. But that's something worth, we're looking at all sorts of good ideas. So that's one possibility. And obviously in Canada, even though they have both channels, it failed this family, which I think is really upset a lot of Canadians, because they see themselves as, broadly, they see themselves as a society that's very open to bringing in refugees like we do. For the UAE, for the Saudi colleague, it's interesting because the press has been criticizing these governments for not taking enough refugees. We wanted to see more funding coming. But the issue of guest workers does raise the question of, well, who's filling those spots? And several countries came back and said, we do have a lot of Syrians in our country now. And I think what they did was they gave work permits and travel visas to talented Syrians, and they could bring their families as well. And so that's not a permanent solution, but it certainly is a temporary fix that I think it does help. But there is a back and forth going on now about the numbers and which countries are doing what, rather than just saying the Gulf. There's a couple countries that haven't done much at all. There's a few countries that are kind of, sometimes they do things, sometimes they don't. And then the Kuwaitis have been fairly consistent in hosting a big conference to help Syria and funding that money through the UN. They chose not to do that with money they're giving to Iraq and Yemen, though. So these are all factors in the very lively conversation we're having. And then on Europe, the number 2 in the German embassy here said to me, I wish we could take 18 to 24 months, which is how long it takes for a refugee from applying to arriving in the US. I wish we could take that long to consider people coming to our countries, but we can't because they're just walking in. And so your security measures, seem like a luxury to us. So they're very concerned about the security too, but they're also, in the case of Germany, they were trying to manage the flow. And they, for example, said to me yesterday that they have an understanding of the Austrians right now that there will be 5 trains a day of 500 refugees, and that's 2,500 per day. Keep them for a couple of days in Munich, and then get them out to the different German lands, their states that they have. That's as much as we can ask, is that the Europeans treat people with dignity, manage the flow, and not just do these very blunt strokes of suddenly throwing up a wall or suddenly turning people away, or some of the more tough things when they bring police in who are treating migrants and refugees as if they're criminals when they're just people who are trying to seek safety.
So why don't we take next questions? Please.
I'll keep it really quick. Thank you for coming today. We've talked a lot about the long term, and how making things happen is much harder. But in the short term, with what's going on in cities today in Greece and in Hungary, where these refugees are arriving or coming from these other places on these boats, what's the U.S.'s role, or what's their response kind of been in the short term in terms of responding to this?
For the migrants in Europe or for all refugees?
For all the refugees, but I mean those coming from Syria to Europe. We know the situations and the conditions in Hungary aren't.
One of the things I wanted to say before actually to the Europe question, or you wanted to call on this person. I'm halfway into my answer here. I'm so excited. Okay, is that all right? In some parts of the world, usually, I forget it's 60 to 80%, something like that, of refugee crises take place in developing countries. Refugees flow to other countries that are developing. So often when there's a crisis and it's spilling over borders, the countries nearby are poor countries, and the governments can be fragile or failing even. And so U.S. assistance can be, substantial. And the UN can play a role of not just helping the government, but sometimes taking on roles that a normal government would be expected to do. And now we're talking about Europe. And so I don't think the U.S. is going to start dictating to European countries, certainly not to the UK, France, Germany, Poland, how they should, manage their borders. They are among the countries that have the most resources to do that. But I think there is a role we can play to be supportive. And trying to figure out exactly what that is a conversation we're having with the Europeans. But for example, we're the top funder of the UN Refugee Agency. We're the top funder of the International Organization for Migration. We've responded very quickly to appeals from them to get their staff out to Macedonia, Serbia, and Greece, where they just don't have really strong responses so far. So I think if we work on the periphery, that could be a way for us to, in terms of our funding, that could be a good contribution. And in terms of our diplomacy, it's really pushing this understanding that migrants are not criminals, but they're humans. And also they can actually have a positive role to play, potentially, in Europe where there's declining demographics. Yes?
Thank you so much for coming. I have a more local concern. I was just wondering what you think the blueprint is for diaspora communities who are trying to help the influx of refugees, not only in advocating for them to come here, but also in helping them. I've definitely seen, I come from a Syrian American community personally in Arizona, and I've seen a sort of a gap between state refugee services and refugee aid groups. So I was wondering if you had any suggestions.
Well, state by state, you're going to get different levels of sort of generosity in the programs for refugees. And I think Arizona is at one end of that spectrum. I'm not 100% certain, but I think that's the case. Although I've met some folks working in Arizona who are really impressive. So I think diaspora groups are so important in bridging between the old country and the new country, if you will, because members of Congress say, well, I have to worry about my constituents, I have to worry about my Americans. And then when the Americans show up looking a lot like the people on the screen, it reminds them, who Americans are, that we are quite diverse, that we come from all over the world, that we practice lots of different religions, and we can too, despite our different backgrounds, all make really good Americans. So that alone is an important role. And also in educating other Americans, trying to explain, when Ebola broke out, there was so much misunderstanding in the U.S. about what were people doing to corpses in West Africa, that they were catching it, and so part of, I know the Liberian diaspora was talking about, funeral rites and things like that had to be changed in part to ensure that there wasn't transmission of disease. So this, I think diaspora groups can really be helpful in explaining things that just appear mysterious at first sight to Americans who have never really focused on that part of the world, on different parts of the world. I have never met so many, I've met a lot of Syrian Americans, but I've never met so many Lebanese Americans. And it turns out They were always there right in front of me. I knew all these Lebanese Americans. I never knew they were Lebanese. I just never, So in a way, the diaspora groups have to sort of stand up and be seen. And if they're groups that have been here a while and have succeeded and have some wealth, that can really help. If they're just arriving and they're trying to make it, that's a lot to ask of a group. But the joke about the Syrian Americans, I don't know what your own experience is, but you walk into a room of Syrian Americans, you go, "Hello, doctor," and they all turn around and go, "Oh, hello." So there's some resources there.
Last question.
Thank you so much for your talk. I know everyone wants to talk about the resettlement, but the reality is there are 4 million refugees when you're talking about Syrians, and no matter how much Western countries are taking, they're still extreme minority. So when it comes to people who are still in Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey, how do you see the humanitarian framework at its current situation addressing the real needs of people? Is adapting to their needs? Because there is a huge frustration. I understand why the Gulf countries are sometimes reluctant because of the overhead of the UN, but we're also talking about the overhead of the UN commissioning international NGOs and then local NGOs and then local institutes on the ground. So what's reaching the refugees is a minuscule amount of what's in reality, and it's always mandate-driven and agenda-driven that doesn't really address their needs. So do you see a shift in the framework and how the UNDP approach of the 3RP and the resilience part can help change that?
Okay.
Thank you.
Let me answer your question in two pieces. So one piece is how do we get more money to come in, to flow in? And that we're working very assiduously on. And it's been, like I say, the U.S. keeps giving and giving, but other countries clearly have not kept up in terms of the long list of crises. So one thing that would help would be a shorter list of crises. If we can bring peace to any parts of the world, that would help. But also, more generosity on the parts of even the traditional donors who I just boasted about, doing most of the work, have not given as much in terms of keeping up with the needs. And that's part of what I think you're going to hear from Europe is that they were giving, but not at record levels, even though this is a record displacement. And now the consequences of that are visible. Because what we're finding is the people are moving for a couple of reasons, and it's partly to find educational opportunities for children, and partly to get jobs, to find ways. Refugees want to support themselves. They don't want to just get a handout every day, day in and day out for years. So that part, I think, is a real a human impulse, and something really that we should appreciate in them. But a lot of the refugees showing up in Europe right now are young men who need jobs, who actually are middle class and educated. So I'm worried about all these kids being uneducated, but the educated ones are walking to Europe. Then, let's see, the second part of your question, though, was how do we get the aid money once we do raise it to get down to the local level? And so I think that money invested in these organizations is well spent. But I know that there are concerns that too much goes. We ended up telling Kuwait that it was 7% overhead, which is not terrible. But they had this impression that it was really bad. And I think you hear it from people in local areas when they see aid workers driving around in big air-conditioned SUVs, and then they don't feel like their lives have changed very much. You can understand how you might draw that conclusion. So we need to look at ways. I already used the word streamline in terms of our process of bringing refugees here, but we need to streamline the ways to get money to the people who need it and show in a way that the local people feel that something is being done for them. They don't feel abandoned. I think it's really tricky. In anticipation of the World Humanitarian Summit, this will be a big issue. One problem the U.S. government has is we can't just go places and fund a lot of local groups and enterprises, because our rules and regs governing our funding are very much set up to avoid waste, fraud, and abuse. And so we have to be, we can't take risks with our money. We have to ensure that we invest over and over again in groups that are big enough to keep good track of the money, do a lot of reports on the money, put together grant proposals in a certain way and form, and submit them online by a certain date. And if you submit it late, forget it, I can't help you at all. So I think in the World Humanitarian Summit, we're going to try to figure out how do we bridge then. I mean, there's the sort of talking point that we're supposed to help more at the local level. And then there's the reality of we're not really set up to do that. So we'll be looking at ways to do that. One idea that we've been talking about is trying to use the Red Cross, Red Crescent societies more, since they are, you know, in origin supposed to be working with volunteers at the local level. And it's a existing movement, but it has very uneven performance across the board. But that might be one way one path forward. Okay?
Yeah, well, we've kept you longer than you promised, and all of you should know, not only is Anne coming off a jet lag, but she has another speech to give. So we're so grateful that you stopped and spent this time with us.
I'm so tickled to see you.
Yeah.
and
you
sir,
know, you said that you felt fortunate to work with John Kerry. Well, we feel fortunate to have you in your job.